Welcome to True Crime Cases. Today, we are unveiling a shocking story. Annika has been attempting to rebuild for years. Her life following her untimely death, her first marriage to her spouse had been full of romantic relationships and the type of steadiness that offered her hope despite challenging period following the death of her spouse. Gone because of a protracted, exhausting sickness, it left her with a gap in her emotions that she could never fully fill. Yet all of a sudden, she was both. Kane is the mother and father of two children. Zoya, who was still in shock over Kane, their father, passed away, and it was just 10 when his dad passed away. Yet even then he showed a level of maturity much above his. He became Annika's rock over the years, assisting with doing housework to ensure Zoya was all right, and he's doing his hardest to bear the obligations that no youngster his age should have. Ought to have. By the time he was 18, Kane had developed into a young man of strength and dependability. He defended his family with ferocity, particularly Zoya, who had a timid and sensitive disposition in spite of his mat. Kane continued to bear the weight of the loss of his father and the burden of Zoya's involvement in the family. Nevertheless, Hand was just 6 years old when their dad died away, leaving a lasting impression on her. And even though she made an effort to be happy, calm manner revealed a lot about the suffering at the age of 14, Zoya was developing into. Despite being a lovely young girl, she, too humble and reticent to acknowledge it, she was the type of individual who made a room with her generosity, but never required care. Annika spent years concentrating only on her children, making sure their home was stable, as much love and food on the table as she was able to donate. But some nights, as she slept, she longed for. She missed the warmth and company of being able to spend her life with someone to confide in and laugh with. Loneliness emerged as a persistent threat in her life, and as time passed, she started to question whether she would ever locate. Annika found joy once more when she met Ayan at she believed she had a community event. Discovered her second shot at love at last. Charmingly attentive, he appeared to sincere curiosity about her life and her. Ayan had a method of making Annika experience something unique that she hadn't. Over the years, he frequently gave her praise. Power letting her know how great it was that she had brought up two amazing. Kane and Zoya were raising their children alone. At first, they showed no interest in Ayan. Weren't against him, but they weren't. Felt a connection right away. Ever watchful, Kane closely monitored Ayan, observing his exchanges with their mother and examining his. Zoya's youthful aspirations didn't consider Ayan highly in one manner or another. She was more preoccupied with her studies and her friends, abandoning the grown-ups to their globe. As Ayan and Annika's friendship, as things went on, she presented him to her children more often. Ayan created an attempt to connect with Zoya and Kane, purchasing them and bringing them out to supper, little presents, and making an effort to participate in. Kane valued their interests, movements, but was unable to get rid of a persistent. He had a strong feeling about Ayan. Seemed strange despite the lack of tangible cause to be suspicious of him. After almost Annika and Ayan made the decision to. Annika was thrilled that they were getting married. That Ayan was the final component needed to. Kane stayed quiet around their relatives, although eventually backed his mother's choice to ensure Zoya's happiness. Also agreed to the marriage with little. Believed that her mother's judgment. Ayan took up residence in their house soon following the wedding, and for a while, he was courteous, and everything appeared to be normal. Supportive and kind to Annika. He even assisted Kane in doing repairs around the home and volunteered to help Zoya with her. Annika was ecstatic to see how her studies. Ayan, however, was assimilating into their family, but below Ayan's seeming Underneath the flawless exterior was a shadow that would shortly make public. Initially, his actions toward. He would give Zoya small compliments, more than required to explain to her how lovely she seemed or how much. Zoya discovered his comments as she grew up. Uneasy, but dismissed them, believing that he was simply being too amiable. As the weeks passed, Ayan's interest in Zoya increased. He would make up reasons to be close to her, volunteering to assist or drive her to school. When Annika wasn't around to help her with her assignment, his compliments became more provocative, and his eyes continued to linger. Too long, Zoya started to shy away from him, feeling anxious whenever possible, but uncertain of how to express her uneasiness. Cain began to notice Zoya's. He observed her shrinking uneasily, avoiding Ayan's touch or offering justifications to get out of the room while he was there. Cain repeatedly questioned her about whether there was a problem, but Zoya always. She forced a grin as she shook her head, wished to avoid burdening her brother, and she definitely didn't want to take a chance. The anger of Ayan was empowered by Zoya's quiet started to cross lines. When Annika was running or at work, he would corner Zoya while running errands, home looking for excuses to touch her. Her hair was brushed off her shoulder, clutching her or putting a hand on her back, her arm to prevent her from leaving. Zoya's heart pounded with terror throughout these times, but she felt helpless too. One evening, while Zoya was stop him. After dinner, Ayan cornered to clean up. In the kitchen, "You look stunning." His voice was low and threatening as he spoke. "You're going to bring great luck to a boy." Zoya attempted to avoid him one day. However, he caught her by the wrist and pulled her near. "What's causing your fear of me?" questioned, his lips forming a sinister curve. "I'm only trying to be kind to you. Smile." Zoya rushed to her after yanking her arm away. She sat in the room, shutting the door behind her. On her bed, trembling and resisting, she wanted to tell her mother to stop crying, cry out for assistance, but Ayan's threats, "If you ever tell," it reverberated in her head. He had threatened to murder everyone. "Do you want your mother, brother, or both?" That Zoya felt on your conscience. Confined, she was unable to inform Cain that, after Ayan's threats, and she was unable to inform Annika, who appeared to be quite content with Ayan. Her quiet began to weigh more heavily daily, and her once bright disposition faded as Cain saw his sister. She began to withdraw farther into herself. Growing more wary of Ayan, he started to observe how Ayan gazed at Zoya, the way he consistently came up with excuses to. "Cain is protective while you're alone with her." His instincts took over, and he began to watch Ayan more closely, but he didn't fully understand the scope of what was going on with Zoya each day. Felt like a struggle. Therefore, she stayed away from Ayan as she tried her best, but his advances grew more hostile. He would storm, enter her room without permission, and obstruct her way. In the corridor and utter offensive remarks, it caused Zoya's stomach to turn. Confined to her own house like a prisoner, always on edge and afraid of what Annika stayed, and Ayan could do it next. Blissfully oblivious to Ayan's actual nature, for which she was really thankful. Existence in her life that she failed to notice. The little adjustments in her kids that she thought they were only getting used to. The fact that everything has a stepfather would eventually settle. But the gloom, the distance Ayan brought into their lives it was becoming putrid after settling. However, beneath the surface, it was only a question of when it would explode. In a manner unable of expected, the months after Ayan's entry into their life signified an unsettling change in the home too. Everything was ideal. Annika. Ayan was the stepfather, the devoted spouse, who had volunteered to assist her in raising her kids, but in private, The truth was coming to light in the most a sinister manner. Zoya lived in unimaginable terror. Ayan's actions, which had begun as uncomfortable praise and persistent touches, had turned into direct mistreatment every time Annika left the house. Ayan took advantage of the chance to corner Zoya, who was previously lively and upbeat. The adolescent now seemed to be carrying an undetectable weight, and her cheerful disposition, dulled by her continual fear. Stepfathers. Ayan was a crafty person who understood how to trick Annika into thinking that he was the ideal stepfather and spouse. When Zoya recoiled from his contact, he dismissed it with a joke over family meals, describing her as bashful and cutely uncomfortable. Annika, overcome with appreciation and love, witnessed nothing to raise suspicions about. But Cain wasn't that easily duped. Cain had always had a keen eye, particularly with regard to his sister. He saw Zoya's avoidance of Alone, how she appeared jittery around Ayan, and Cain attempted to calm himself whenever he was around him, to repeatedly speak to herself. But Zoya kept quiet about her dread of Ayan's warnings to keep her quiet. Encouraged by Annika's and Zoya's quiet ignorance started to worsen his abuse. He began going into Zoya's room. Under the guise of inspecting at night, Zoya would lay frozen on her bed on her, acting like Ayan is sleeping, muttered offensive remarks into the. She would wait in the dark until he eventually departed before sobbing silently. Her body shook in terror, and eventually the tipping point was reached. Zoya was at home alone in the afternoon with Ayan. Annika was out running errands, and Zoya was still at school when Cain made an effort to occupy herself in her room, wishing Ayan would stop bothering her. But Ayan interrupted her since he had other intentions. Uninvited chamber, his eyes shining with a rapacious appetite that caused Zoya's upset stomach that you won't keep. He spoke in a low voice, disregarding me, and threatening. He shut the door, sealing it behind him. Zoya retreated from her emotions on the inside, racing as Ayan moved closer to her. She pleaded, "Please, just leave me alone." Although her voice was trembling, Ayan wasn't. As he listened, he took hold of her arm and pulled. Near as she fought to escape, hissing his hold, he said, "You're mine. No one will ever love you the way you tighten." Zoya's cries reverberated through the manor, the home, but nobody was around to listen. Them, or so she believed. Cain had made a decision. Must return home early that day, because his stomach, communicating to him that something wasn't correct as he. Upon entering the home, he heard Zoya's sobs from the panic room upstairs, swept through him as he let go of his bag and hurried up the steps 2 at a time. Cain once barged into Zoya's room. The scene that met his eyes sparked a fury he had never experienced before. To Ayan was pinned down on top of Zoya, as under him she fought, and her face was screamed and smeared with tears, transformed into relief-filled sobbing upon seeing Ayan. Cain is standing at the doorway. His face froze, contorting into a mask of defiance and rage. "Aren't what it?" He seemed to have stumbled, but Cain wasn't. As Zoya listened, she scurried away from Ayan. Is sprinting over to Cain, holding his, for months, arm. "Hek has been doing this." He stated he'd heard her sob, her voice cracking. "If I tell anyone about Cain's blood, murder us." Heated and balled his fists in his, with red-hot fury, his eyesight becomes blurry. Zoya was softly pulled behind him. "Protective instincts take control," he told her forcefully in his voice low, and Zoya hesitated since it was perilous, but Cain's tone made it impossible to argue, so she ran away. Her tears reverberated across the room. Cain looked back in the corridor to Ayan, who was now making an effort to calm down. "You don't comprehend." Ayan started speaking shakily. "I was Cain lunged before he could finish. The first blow struck him solidly on Ion's mouth, causing him to stumble. Cain snarled as you touched her backside, venomous in his voice. You believe you can get away with harming her. Ion attempted to defend himself. However, Cain's anger was an unstoppable blow, following a hit to Ion's face and body, all of which were fed by Cain's repressed. Ion pleaded for compassion in a fit of rage and contempt. But the baseball bat continued to strike Cain, grabbed Cain's eye in the room's corner. He grabbed it with his eye without thinking, tightening the hold on the wooden handle. "You're not worthy of mercy," he said. High over his head, the bat made the first. Ion's ribs broke under the swing, emitting a scream of anguish the second. His arm made contact with the swing, and third with blood splattered on his head. However, Cain didn't care that he was across the room. Swung the bat again with each blow, letting go the rage that had been accumulating within him for months. Zoya, upon hearing the disturbance, I hurried back upstairs. Her gaze froze at the doorway. Her eyes widened in terror at seeing her, Ion's bleeding brother, standing over. Cain's body stopped, and she let out a cry, gushing down her cheeks. "He's worthless. Please simply stop it." But Cain was unable to. When he heard her, his only thought was Zoya's suffering and anxiety as a result of Ion. He had taken away her innocence. Ion's body didn't go slack until his chest that no longer rises and falls. At last, Cain ceased, and the only sound in the room was Cain dropped the bat during Zoya's cries. His hands trembling, he gazed down at what Ion's dead body lay where he had done it, collapsed on the ground, causing blood to collect. Cain's chest heaved around him as the excitement started to wear off. Crushing force of what had just occurred, Zoya rushed to embrace her in Cain's arms encircling him. They both declined to the "I'm so sorry" floor, she muttered. I didn't know why my voice was choking with tears. I was terrified. What should I do? Cain held. He closed his eyes and started crying. Freely, he continued, "It's not your fault." Gently, "None of this belongs to you." Their issue was that they sat there for what seemed like hours embracing one another as the truth of what had transpired started to set in. Zoya eventually withdrew, wiping her. "We need to contact Mom," she whispered, sobbing. Cain nodded. His thoughts were racing because he knew they also needed to dial 911, but he wasn't prepared to accept the repercussions of his behavior. "Just yet," he continued in a voice. "You call Mom." "Zoya, I'll contact the police." Cain is resolute despite his hesitation. There was no space for debate in her face. Nodded before departing the room, leaving Cain behind. Ion's dead corpse by himself as Cain called 911 because he couldn't get the believing that both his and Zoya's lives would be different forever. But as he glanced, he was aware of one thing down at Ion for. Sure, he would repeat the entire process if it means defending his sister in the wake of Ion's passing. Was a whirlwind of passion and law, had caused the family to struggle with the repercussions of Cain's behavior and the dark reality that had emerged. Illumination. The home was in disarray. The air was heavy when the cops came. Zoya clutched with tension and unfiltered emotion. She looked teary-eyed and pallid to her brother. Annika stood frozen in horror as the street, attempting to comprehend what she just discovered, that Cain sat calmly but resolutely on the couch's hands are still discolored by. He didn't fight against Ion's blood when the officers requested that he rise, and I put him in handcuffs, and he admitted his stable but full of. I murdered him out of tiredness because he was causing harm to my sister. The cops traded looks, their face changing from Prof. Profil's lack of subtlety, compassion. They had witnessed several instances of brutality, but Cain's honesty, speech, and the utter destruction on. They could see from Zoya's look that this wasn't a basic offense of rage. There had been something far darker taking place in this home while Cain was. Annika broke and was led out of the home. She fell and landed on the ground. She clutched her chest while crying uncontrollably. Zoya hurried to wrap her body at her side. "Mom, I'm sorry." She put her arms around her mother. She said in a tremulous whisper, "Didn't know how to express to you how." Annika gazed at her daughter with fear, experienced a combination of remorse and grief. She sobbed, "So why didn't you tell me? I would have stopped if I had protected you." With tears flowing down her face, Zoya shook her head. "He threatened to murder us if she didn't wash her cheeks. I told everyone that I was terrified he would hurt me. Neither Cain nor you knew what to do." Annika was devastated by the weight of Zoya's comments. She became aware of her blindness. She had firmly believed in a man who had not only deceived her, but had also broken the very kids she had promised to keep safe. She was overcome with remorse for failing to notice a yawn entered their life. The warning indications that she is not being met. Annika's daughter's grief became rage. She looked at the bloodstains on where Ion's corpse had been on the floor. She was not saddened by Ion's passing, only rage at the suffering he had brought forth for her kids. She promised to support Cain, and, regardless of what transpired Cain was questioned at the police station on what transpired before Ion's death. His account of the mistreatment was transparent, and he was harming my sister in an uncompromising manner. Cain spoke in an emotionally charged tone. He was on top of her when I got home. According to her, he had been doing it for her. I lost it for months because I couldn't let him get. The detectives listened and took it away. Their grim attitudes were intense. Zoya's assertion supporting Cain's narrative and tangible proof from the crime scene supporting allegations of mistreatment that Ion's activities had left. His DNA left traces on Zoya's body, her attire, and it was evident that he had been abusing her sexually. Zoya's sitting through the testimony was devastating. Opposite the detectives, she described, in meticulous detail, how Ion's mistreatment had started, how things had become worse, and how she had been terrified all her life. "I didn't want anybody to suffer harm," murmured with tears in my eyes, "but I wasn't sure how. He threatened to murder us all if we didn't stop him." If I advised her to speak out and be bold, strengthen the argument against Ion, even in death, the investigators identified the toll it took on her emotions to relive those moments, but her remarks were essential in setting the scene. Regarding Cain's conduct when the matter was brought to trial attracted a lot of media attention. Pay attention to the tale of a teenager who murdered his stepfather in order to defend his sister, connected with the general public, igniting discussions on justice, self-protection, and the shortcomings of the legal framework to safeguard abuse victims. Cain's defense lawyer presented a striking image of the proceedings preceding. After Ion passed away, he detailed the months of Zoya had been tormented by the threats. When Ion made, and the instant Cain entered on, this is not the tale of an assault, cold-blooded murderer, the lawyer contended, the tale of a young guy who accomplished this, what any devoted brother would do in such situation. When confronted with unspeakable wickedness, Zoya spoke in court with a calm voice, yet emotionally charged. She described the mistreatment she had experienced and how Ion had. She was coerced and intimidated into. "Cain saved me," she whispered in quiet, staring. "He shielded me from the jury immediately. I owe him because I was unable to defend myself." Annika also raised her voice in life. She was shaking as she apologized for failing to notice the warning indicators. "I had brought that man into our house earlier." Tears were flowing down her cheeks as she said, believed in him, and he deceived us in Cain did what I did in the worst way conceivable. Ought to have confronted a yawn. When the prosecution was the only one who could claim that Cain's behavior exceeded self-defense, highlighting the violence due to the assault and the reality that he continued until Ion's death, although that, according to the defense, Cain's conduct were the outcome of a month-long pent-up anger. With an intense desire to safeguard his sister, the jury discussed the case for a number of days prior to rendering a decision. Cain was convicted of manslaughter by voluntary means. However, the judge, considering the circumstances, imposed a sentence of very shortened term. This was a sad circumstance. The judge stated during sentence that the law does not support vigilante justice, as this is evidently the young man's actions were motivated by deep affection for his sister, along with a want to. Cain's punishment for protecting her was fulfilled. Having varying responses, some feeling, others thought that justice had been served. He ought to have been completely exonerated. Cain was generally preferred by the people. Many people viewed him as a hero who had completed what the system was unable to do to prevent Julian Annika, a predator, paid Cain a visit. Consistently, during his imprisonment, their family's bond became stronger as they helped one another through the Annika sought treatment for herself after the event, and Zoya was resolved to assist her. Daughter recovers from her ordeal, endured Zoya with patience and encouragement, started to reconstruct her life after discovering courage in her brother's steadfast affection and sacrifice. When he was released, he received tears and hugs from his family despite the encounter had transformed him, and he was resolved on and create a life for. I don't regret what I did, he said to a reporter who spoke with him. I would do it again after his release if it meant defending sister. The catastrophe that transpired in Annika's home was a sharp contrast to serving as a reminder of the atrocities of abuse and the length that individuals will go to shield their loved ones from Cain's behavior. Extremes were created out of love, yet a pressing urge to put a stop to the pain